So here at Lancaster University we've made a recent discovery. We've found for the first time that there are literally millions of tiny magnetic crystals inside human brains. And those crystals shouldn't be there. They consist of magnetite, a strongly magnetic material that is damaging to our brains. It causes the formation of very reactive oxygen species such as free radicals that cause cell damage and eventually cell death, the hallmarks of diseases like Alzheimer's disease. Where do these particles come from? They look strikingly similar to magnetic particles that occur in the airborne pollution mix. And where do those particles arise from? They come from vehicles, particularly through combustion of fuel, through the frictional heating of brake pads, and we can actually walk down the street and be breathing those particles up through our noses and directly inside our brains. Our work doesn't yet prove a causal link between these particles in the atmosphere and Alzheimer's disease, but it's a potential environmental risk factor that we can't afford to ignore.
Another example is the array of technologies, often referred to collectively as geoengineering, that potentially could help reverse the warming effects of global climate change. One that has gained my personal attention is stratospheric aerosol injection, or SAI, a method of seeding the stratosphere with particles that can help reflect the sun's heat in much the same way that volcanic eruptions do. An SAI program could limit global temperature increases, reducing some risks associated with higher temperatures and providing the world economy additional time to transition from fossil fuels. This process is also relatively inexpensive. The National Research Council estimates that a fully deployed SAI program would cost about $10 billion yearly. As promising as it may be, moving forward on SAI would also raise a number of challenges for our government and for the international community. On the technical side, greenhouse gas emission reductions would still have to accompany SAI to address other climate change effects, such as ocean acidification, because SAI alone would not remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. On the geopolitical side, the technology's potential to alter weather patterns and benefit certain regions of the world at the expense of other regions could trigger sharp opposition by some nations. Others might seize on SAI's benefits and back away from their commitment to carbon dioxide reductions. And as with other breakthrough technologies, global norms and standards are lacking to guide the deployment and implementation of SAI and other geoengineering initiatives. Now, I could go on and on and on and on about the things that fascinate me.
We shall propose further cooperative efforts between all the nations in weather prediction and eventually in weather control.
It lays the predicate and the foundation for the development of a weather satellite that will permit man to determine the world's cloud layer and ultimately to control the weather, and he who controls the weather will control the world. That will permit man to determine the world's cloud layer, and he who controls the weather will control the world.
Please welcome David Keith. Mr. Keith, Dr. Keith, what do you got? What are you calling you?
I'm good with Mr.
Mr. Keith. Okay, all right. Now you got a little book here called A Case for Climate Engineering. How will we save the planet? Because all the people, all the Chicken Littles out there are saying the planet is warming up. You don't believe that, do you?
I totally believe it. It is warming up, and I've been thinking about, along with many other people, ways to stop it.
Okay. Does it involve me using one of those little pigtail light bulbs?
That is a useful thing to do, and I have those in my house, but I'm thinking about something else.
Okay, good. What's the other thing? Because I'd like to do anything other than that.
Exactly.
Okay, so what do we do?
So the other thing is horrifying. It is that you could actually spray sulfuric acid into the stratosphere 20 kilometers over our head and use that to stop the planet warming up in a ugly tech fix.
You can spray something into the atmosphere to change. Okay,
spray pollution into the atmosphere to stop it warming.
So in the end, pollution saved them all. We owe pollution. We owe acid rain an apology, is what you're saying.
It would be a totally imperfect technical fix. fix.
Okay.
It would have risks. It wouldn't get us out of the long-run need to stop polluting, but it might actually save people and be useful.
Okay, so how, again, I interrupt you slightly there. How does it work? How many planes are we talking about here? How do you do this?
So let's say you wanted to stop it warming in 2020. You'd start with a fleet of just 2 or 3 kind of modified business jets.
What kind of like a G6?
Yeah, like a G650.
Like a G6.
That's
like
it.
a G6.
And you'd put, say, 20,000 tons of sulfuric acid into the stratosphere every year, and each year you have to put a little more, and this doesn't, in the long run, mean that you can forget about cutting emissions. We will need to rein in emissions.
We'll get to it eventually,
But it does.
But in the meantime, we're shrouding the Earth in sulfuric acid.
So people are terrified about talking about this because they're scared that it will prevent us cutting emissions.
Right, and also that it's sulfuric acid. You're bearing the lead. Is there any possible way this could come back to bite us in the ass? Blanketing the Earth in sulfuric acid, because I'm all for it. This is the all-chocolate dinner. I still get to have my CO2, and I just need to spray sulfuric acid.
Right.
All over the Earth.
Right question, but we put 50 million tons of sulfuric acid in the air now as pollution, and it kills 1 million people a year worldwide.
Okay, and that's good or bad?
It's terrible.
But it'll be better if we put more in.
We're talking about 1% of that, a tiny fraction of that. So we should reduce that sulfuric acid
So if it
pollution.
kills 1 million people and we're only
bad.
doing 1% more, we're just killing 10,000 more people.
You can do math.
Okay.
But that's, so killing people is not the objective here.
Killing people, not the objective. I just wanted to be clear.
Actually slowing climate change, actually stopping climate change in a way that could help people this generation, people living now, in a way there's no other easy alternative.
Can you just do it for part of the planet?
Pretty much the whole planet.
No, but could you? Could you just just make things better for the United States?
Very hard to do. It seems that this is mostly global. But the big fear is that one country will want it one way and one the other, like 2 frat boys arguing over the thermostat. And in many ways, the biggest fear here, we have no idea how to actually agree about how to control the planet's thermostat.
So let's say the United States and China say, yeah, let's do it. But Russia and India say, yeah, not do it.
This is the kind of stuff I wake up sweating about. Exactly.
Well, it's your goddamn idea.
No, it actually turns out to be an old idea. This was known since President Johnson, and the scientific community mostly decided not to talk about it for fear that people would then lose the threat of cutting emissions.
Now, what happens to the sulfuric acid after it's sprayed? Does it just stay up there?
No, it rains down.
Okay.
But as I said, it rains down.
Okay.
It's a tiny addition to what we're already doing.
Have you gotten some grief for suggesting this?
Sure. I mean, this is like writing a book that's the case for leprosy. But
do you have one of those? Is that next? Yeah, it's a great weight loss plan.
But also many people are happy that people are finally talking about this, because while it is ugly, it does appear that it really could do some good.
Could an individual start this?
In practice, only a country, a big country.
What about a man in like a hollowed out volcano with henchmen who occasionally shakes his fist at the sky and says, "They said I was a fool at Harvard. Who's the fool now?"
It's the natural worry.
Want to shake your fist?
I won't.
Want to shake your fist and say the fools?
It's the natural worry, but I think in the end, no. This would be done by major countries, but the problem is how countries agree about where to set the thermostat, who decides, and my biggest reason for writing the book and for talking about it is my view that we won't make good decisions in ignorance.
So we have to have the discussion now, so that when it becomes our last hope, people can say, "Hey, we talked about this. Remember, we said we get to do it."
The worst way to make decisions about this would be if we all agree that we won't talk about it in polite society, we suppress it, which is basically what had been happening, and then in 2030, suddenly in a crisis, we make fast decisions.
Maybe it's happening already. You ever look at those planes up there? They have contrails behind them. Maybe all those planes with the contrails, maybe they're actually spraying chemicals into the atmosphere right now, and Uncle Sam isn't telling us.
Seems extremely unlikely.
The fact that the United States is not telling something to its citizens, that seems extremely likely to me. Read the newspaper. I think they might have your idea already. Dr. Mister, thank you so much. David Keith, A Case for Climate Engineering. We'll be right back.
There's no question that large-scale climate engineering is untested and dangerous. We've mostly thought about sulfur, and there's a lot of good reasons to think about sulfur, because sulfur's what nature does, and there are very good reasons to think we would like to start very slowly if we ever wanted to do this, and do something that was an analog to nature, because we have some idea what the downsides of what nature does are. Nevertheless, there might be some good reasons to think about alumina. It turns out, first of all, there's been a lot of work on the environmental consequences of alumina in the stratosphere, because it's in shuttle exhausts. There's a bunch of papers that look at the radiative and ozone-destroying properties of alumina in the stratosphere, and those make you think it might be useful. The big deal really is that alumina has 4 times the volumetric radiative forcing for small particles as does sulfur, and that means you have 4 times less surface area for the same radiative forcing, and this is a much bigger deal, you have roughly 16 times less the coagulation rate, and that's the thing that really drives removal. So you could get away, we think, with much smaller mass fluxes, but we haven't run those studies yet, so that might be wrong. The little picture is from a nanofabrication study, which shows you can make very high quality, and do this in just a jet in a very simple way, make high quality alumina particles just by spraying aluminum vapor out, which oxidizes. So it's certainly in principle possible to do that. There's a big literature that's already looked at that. Look at the alumina or sulfuric acid functions, which are the mass-specific backscatter, so a measure of radiative forcing, and in fact I have it in watts per square meter per megaton. And those things fall off as the particles get larger, but even more important, the fall speed rises quite rapidly in this regime, and so as particles stick together and get large, they fall out of the stratosphere very quickly. And so particles that are too large are much less effective per unit mass.
If I could just clarify, so 10 megatons of aluminum dumped into the atmosphere would have no human health impact.
So let me be more careful here. Work to separate out the toxicological. Well, so the alumina, we've only begun to research and publish nothing. We haven't done anything serious on alumina, and so there could be something terrible that we'll find tomorrow we haven't looked at. Aerosol geoengineering looks like it is so cheap that the cost is basically not going to be an issue. That means that implementation decisions will be risk-to-risk decisions. The risk of doing it against the risk of not doing it. And it makes the problem of how we govern it fundamentally harder and different and novel. Another reason why I think more knowledge is good is I think this will turn out to be more complicated and harder to do than we now think. So I've told you that it's cheap to deliver materials to the stratosphere, and I'm convinced that's true. I don't think that will change. But I think the more we do research, the less easy this will look, the more complicated the environmental effects will look, and that's a good thing, because right now it looks too easy. So I think that if we do more research, we're likely to find out that it's harder and more complicated than we thought, and the side effects are harder to manage, and that's a healthy outcome that will make it easier to do the management. It's an empirical question, how people will actually react to knowledge about this. Another reaction is to say, if these crazy scientists are so concerned about putting CO2 in the atmosphere, they want to think about these things, then that might actually mean we should be more serious about the risks of CO2 in the atmosphere. And by the way, it's not really a moral hazard, it's more like free riding on our grandkids. And by the way, it's not really a moral hazard, it's more like free riding on our grandkids.
Our next guest is the former Vice President of the United States. Please welcome Vice President Al Gore. And what are you... Well, first of all, let me ask you this question, because there's a rumor, I don't know if this is true or not, that some scientists are trying to figure out a way to block the sun to try to slow down global warming.
Yeah, it's a measure of the feeling of desperation that some of them feel.
Are they really thinking they could do that?
Well, some of them are seriously proposing. You put another kind of pollution, sulfur dioxide, up to orbit cover the atmosphere. The sky won't be really blue in the way it is now anymore, but it would block out some of the sun's heat so that we wouldn't have to take the difficult steps to stop spewing all this global warming pollution into the atmosphere. And of course, there are a lot of problems with what they're proposing. It turns out plants need sunlight.
Yes.
It wouldn't stop the acidification of the ocean.
This phenomena of chemtrails. And you know, when I was a kid, I used to see these trails in the sky all the time and say, oh, that's cool, a jet just went over. And then you started to see a whole bunch of them, and next thing you know, everybody in your neighborhood was fighting and arguing and you didn't know why. Okay, and you really didn't know why. I mean, everybody was fighting.
They're coming after our minds, I'm telling you the truth. Now, I was told not to speak about chemtrails over and over again. Don't speak about chemtrails. Why not? They're spraying our skies with poison, with aluminum, with barium.
Shortly after 9/11, like a lot of military veterans, I raised my right hand and I took an oath to the Constitution to hopefully do something meaningful with my life. 19 years old, unsure what I wanted to do. So I enlisted in the U.S. Air Force. My job in the U.S. Air Force was working in bioenvironmental engineering. So throughout 9 years, I worked as an industrial hygienist and an environmental specialist. There's 2 bases I was at that are called air logistics centers. What does that mean? It's not like a fighter wing, it's not really fun and amazing. What they did is they took aircraft that around every 10 to 15 years, they were required to be dismantled down to the last screw. So that meant every single industrial process you can think about, checking the metal integrity, making sure everything's good to go, or sometimes overhauling equipment. Part of my job in tracking the health hazards was to look at any time someone wanted to buy a chemical, any type of chemical. It was ordered through a system, and in that system, I had to go in there and say, the country we're in, we're not allowed to use this. We need to substitute it out with something a little less hazardous, while also maintaining the integrity for a technical order, meaning for that process, it says you must use, xylene or toluene to do this process. Well, I have to kind of fast forward. I want to say around 2006, I started kind of opening my eyes to how the military wasn't really what I thought it was. And people approached me knowing what I did for a living and said, "Have you ever heard of chemtrails?" Well, I hadn't. And that sparked my interest. So I went online and I looked at chemtrails. I saw a lot of, debunking, a lot of sites that were just kind of calling it a conspiracy theory. And I thought, well, geez, this is what I do for a living. Preventive health, making sure that people are not getting sick, especially in the workplace, and by things that we're doing that can affect, human health in the environment. To summarize it, in an attempt to debunk this conspiracy theory as I thought it was, I didn't debunk it. It literally changed my life. One day I was going through that computer system, which if you want to look it up, it's called an Air Force Form 3952. It is the approval of hazardous materials. I was finding tons and tons of large quantities of aluminum, barium, strontium in the forms of oxides and sulfates. And of course I knew that there's industrial processes you may not have heard of, but it's bead blasting, pneumatic sanding, shot peening. There is certain medias that's similar to that is used. However, I had already accounted for that. I would sit and look at this computer system and say, this shop wants to order this paint. I'm going to tie it to a task. We had to know what was being used, why it was being used, tracking it cradle to grave, and how we were going to dispose of it to be compliant with OSHA and the EPA. One of the legal requirements in approving these is looking at what used to be called the material safety data sheet. On that sheet, it's going to list the manufacturer. It's going to list some maybe required personal protective equipment that needs to be used, or some ways to mitigate the exposures. These electronic MSDSs did not have a manufacturer name. They were very vague. They almost looked to me like somebody had made it and scanned it into the system. So I asked the question, what is this being used for? I never got an answer, so I didn't approve it. And it sat there. And then the heat came down. Are you behind on your 3952s? Only a select few of us did that. So I started asking questions. And at that point, my demonization began. I made my rank. I was decorated. I was a non-commissioned officer of the quarter. I won lots of awards. I had no reason for anyone to attempt to demonize me. So then I get moved over to the other Air Logistics Center. There's only 2 in the Air Force, which is in Warner Robins, Georgia. This kind of carried with me. And I thought, you know what? Should I revisit this? Is it worth it? Did I hit something? Maybe it's need to know. I started finding the same things at Robins Air Force Base. I was now doing some more investigation work. Part of what I did was to use a high volume air sampler to air sample up to, I'd say, a football field in about 10 minutes. I also conducted soil sampling because I thought, you know, if this is real and they are spraying this, it's going to get to the ground. So I conducted air sampling, I conducted soil sampling, and I was getting high levels of these contaminants. When I started asking the question again under a new commander, I never in my life thought I would have somebody look me in the face and tell me, I am questioning you. Is there something wrong with you? You've been looking really depressed lately. You know I can put you under mental evaluation for up to 120 days. Who would take care of your daughter? Because I was divorced at the time. As soon as I heard that, I knew. It validated everything I ever thought. And I thought, I've spent 9 years of my life trying to protect human health, and here we are violating law after law after law. Just sitting here, instead of protecting the people, we are poisoning the people.
Latest goes, get a look at this. I want to show you this. This is the radar imagery of the past 3 hours, and this is from more than likely military exercises going on in a designated area off the coast of Key West now. What they do is they sometimes throw some materials in the air that are supposedly non-toxic, and it does show up on the radar. What they use it for is deflecting radar beams for disguising themselves, usually ships or aircraft in this case. And you can see that this is just not a rain pattern that you would normally expect with a frontal system. Now, the visible satellite imagery will confirm that. We look down there for any kind of clouds, and you don't see any out there. So obviously not rain, false echoes from that, again, more than likely military exercises going on down off the coast of the Key West area. Water vapor imagery showing the dry air in place now all across the
last weather segment. This is inevitably military or something going on. The government, the Air Force, they send out what's known as chaff, and it's a way to experiment with the radar systems. And when you see this kind of a pattern like this, you can rest assured there's something going on. They're actually little bitty magnetic and little bitty strips of, whether it's aluminum, you know, they change it, but what happens is the radar deflects off of all these little pieces, and they use it actually as a jamming mechanism for radar in warfare, but it can also jam our radar and make rain appear that there really is no rain out there. Later on tomorrow, there could be a few showers.
Northern California, we've got a bit of an unusual situation. Now, this first portion of the radar cycle, fairly bland and typical, but then you see these bands of very distinct cloud cover moving into the region. That is not rain, that is not snow, believe it or not. Military aircraft flying through the region is dropping chaff. Small bits of aluminum, sometimes it's made of plastic, or even metallicized paper products, but it's used as an anti-radar issue, and obviously they're up there practicing. Now, they won't confirm that, but I was in the Marine Corps for many years, and I'll tell you right now, that's what it is. 50 in Medford right now, 48 in Wairika, 42 in Klamath Falls. Forecast for tonight.